welcome everybody to the new speedrun. For those watching on YouTube, we're starting this at 3 a.m. It's February the 8th. And I know that I've been kind of mentioning and implying a new speedrun for quite a long time. I know that people are kind of getting impatient for what's going to be next. I think this is going to be my fourth one. I didn't want to rush the new speedrun because I wanted to develop a new concept, and I wanted to make sure that the instructive value does not drop kind of like, you know, the value of a sequel and then part 3 and part 4. I mean, that just tends to happen with anything that starts off as a popular thing. So I wanted to give it time. I might continue my old speedrun, Frankfurt Airport, for a couple more games. I'm going to intersperse that with the new one. But without further ado, let me explain in brief, short terms what the concept of the new speedrun is. I can't guarantee that you're going to like it. It's a bit of a difference from what you've been watching with Frankfurt Airport. And please feel free to be completely honest in the YouTube comments. Give me your honest feedback so I know which direction to take this. If you like it, let me know. But if you feel like this is not up to instructional par, tell me that as well. All I want is honesty, because if this doesn't work out, we can just go back to like the 15-minute format. In short, we are going to revert back to the time control of my very first speedrun, which is 5-minute games. The main reason for this is that there's a lot of demand for improving your blitz skills. This is a very popular time control, and I think that we can check that off the list as well. Of course, the downside is that it is much harder to explain my moves during the game. And so this is why I'm going to take a slightly different approach. And the overarching theme of this speedrun is going to be to develop your instincts. What I'm going to try to do, what I'm going to try to gear the games toward, is helping explain how I'm able to react instinctively, how I'm able to make moves very quickly, and essentially try to extract the subconscious process that contributes to the vast majority of decisions that are made in a blitz game, and sometimes to decisions made in rapid and even classical chess. You know that a lot goes on in the very first 2 or 3 seconds, or even less, that you look at a position, particularly in blitz. And developing those instincts, that kind of GPS, is incredibly important. In previous speedruns, I've really tried to kind of flesh out the process step by step. What I'm going to try to do in this speedrun is talk a little bit less during the games. I'm going to make relatively brief points. And after the game, I'm going to try to hit on the most important, the critical moments in the game. There might be 5 or 6 of them. And I'm going to try to emphasize how I was able to make relatively quick instinctual decisions. Where were the critical moments in the game? If there was stuff to calculate, I will explain that as well. So this is not the only thing that I'm going to be talking about, but this is going to be the kind of main theme of the speedrun as I envision it right now, subject to change. So finally, I did play a couple of games on this account, which I've called Hebeka Raris for obvious reasons. My current 5-minute rating is about 1200. I did attempt earlier iterations of the speedrun at a lower rating. They didn't work out particularly well, so we're going to start at a rating of about 1200. I know that some people like to watch me go through the very beginner ranks, but I think this is a happy medium where if you're a total beginner and you're watching this, I think you can still learn a lot from games at this rating. I'm still somewhat provisional, so we're going to rise pretty quickly to 1500, and we're going to spend a lot of time at that kind of most popular intermediate level. Of course, I'm also going to play my main opening repertoire. Everything I did in the previous speedrun, I'm not going to limit myself, but the goal in these YouTube videos is going to be to play 3 or 4 games, approximately, depending on length, per video. And the analysis time per each game is going to be less, but hopefully that will be compensated by the amount of games. Okay, guys, without further ado, thank you for listening to the rant, to the speech, but for people watching on YouTube, I hope that makes sense. And I will talk more about the concepts in subsequent videos, but I know you're itching to watch me play, so let's go. Okay, playing Leo Yago, 1298. We are going to have essentially the same repertoire as my previous speedrun, which was opening themed. This will hopefully help you acquire more practice with a couple of distinctions. I'm going to focus on the Gleck system against e4, e5. Okay, here, of course, our opponent plays the Philidor. Essentially, the opening repertoire will remain the same. Okay, so against the Philidor, the main move is d4, but I really like to start with bishop c4. It's a tricky little move. Our opponent responds with h6. Now we're going to open up the center with d4. Okay, we're going to take back with a knight, and we're going to continue our development. Maybe our opponent wants to expand on the queen side, but that's not very scary because they haven't developed anything, essentially. We're going to keep developing knight e5. That hits the bishop. I'm going to stay on the diagonal. Already, it feels like our opponent's in big trouble because they haven't prioritized development. And we're going to try to punish this. So, of course, I can play bishop f4 and complete my development. But often the way to punish this type of play is to kind of start the pawn storm pretty early. f4, super tempting move, just chasing away the knight and establishing the preconditions for potential pawn storm on the king side. All right, now I'm going to follow my gut, and I'm going to play the move knight to f5, hopefully initiating what I think is a very favorable trade. Our opponent plays king f8. Let's grab the bishop pair. Okay, now we have an awesome position, but we haven't completed our development yet. I think this is a good time to do that. So let's go bishop e3. And at this point, with the king being as weak as it is, with the pawn on d6 being a major weakness, and our opponent is still not emphasizing his or her development, so it's a good time for us to start looking for decisive tactics. We're almost there. I think we need a little bit more buildup before we could start considering a move like e5. Although on second thought, no. On second thought, we're going to go e5. On second thought, we're going to go e5. Yeah, d5, our opponent tries to keep the center closed. And my instinct here is definitely to capture on d5. But here we need to do a little bit of calculation. So takes, knight takes. Okay, looks extremely promising, obviously. Queen, let's see. Yeah, takes, knight d5, queen d8, bishop c5 check, king e8. Then we can sink our teeth into d6. Yeah, that's winning. Let's go. So as you can see, I did a little bit of calculation, enough to give myself a good sense. But this is a very low-stakes sacrifice. We've only given away a piece for 2 pawns. So it's not like we need to prove anything immediately. I think this is completely winning. I mean, just look at look at Black's pieces. He's playing without a queen side. This is going to be over in a couple moves. Queen d7 doesn't really change what I want to do. Let's give it a little check. Okay, now a very important moment. This knight on e7 is the weakest piece. What's defending it? Well, the queen is defending it and the other knight is defending it. Which is the easier piece to attack? Well, it seems to be the knight on g6. And so the logical move is f5, relying on the very important tactical detail that the bishop is pinning the knight. This is over. Black is collapsing on all fronts here. Queen d5. Okay, our opponent panics, but there's not much to do. We just take back, and the rest is simple. Actually, bishop takes f5, rook takes f5 is really funny. Illustrates the power of a pin. Yeah. I mean, look at this. The queen and the rook are both hanging. My guess is our opponent will go like king g8 or king e8, but then we can grab the pawn on f7. Checkmate. Okay, pretty quick and dirty there. Let's go through the critical moments. Now, this was a fairly straightforward game. Our opponent played the Philidor. Bishop c4 is kind of my recommended move against the Philidor. It's very, very flexible because if Black plays knight f6, you can play d3 kind of Italian style, or you can play d4 and go back into like main Philidor territory. I've had some games here in the previous speedrun. h6 is already inaccurate. And clearly the response should be to open up the center. Our opponent takes on d4. Wait, let me refresh the board. Knight takes d4, c6, knight c3. Already we have 3 pieces developed. Our opponent has 0. Knight d7. So here I'm just developing. Knight e5, bishop b3. 1 point for newer players is anytime you have a bishop on b3 like this, you have to be careful about, these various tricks and traps where essentially a pawn advances to c4, a4, and traps the bishop. The most famous instance of this is the Noah's Ark trap. The Noah's Ark trap can manifest itself in several different ways, but the most famous is in the Steinitz, the deferred Steinitz variation of the Ruy Lopez. If white plays the move d4, Black responds with b5, bishop b3, knight takes d4. And in this position, it's a huge mistake to play queen takes d4 because Black pushes c5, and you should see what's going on. No pun, see what's going on. Pawn is advancing to c4. White can try to counterpose this by attacking the rook, but unfortunately the bishop comes out with tempo. Check, back, Queen d5 looks like a draw. Nope, because now the rook is defended and black pushes c4. A lot of strong players have fallen for this. But in the game position, c5 could not be less scary. There's a million ways to face this. It's also an extremely weakening move. The simplest is just to go knight f5. And c4, bishop drops into a4, d6 is collapsing. This is not scary. Bishop e7, chasing away the knight with f4. Now the move knight f5, bishop f5, e takes f5. I didn't calculate this position. I just assumed that we get the bishop pair, we get the e file, and the knight on g6 is no good squares. Because if knight h4, then it could get trapped. If knight back to f8, just look at this position. This is a disaster. Rook e1, queen h5. There's a million moves here. King f8, knight takes e7, grab the bishop pair. Bishop e3, complete the development. h5 is another meaningless move. And this was maybe the most important moment of the game. How did I quickly and instinctively decide on the move e5? Well, the basic premise here is that black's position is in shambles. We have a huge lead in development. The textbook way to punish that is by opening up the center. And e5 is the easiest way to do that. If black plays d takes e5, who can tell me the specific move that I had in mind here with white? And don't tell me bishop c5, because queen takes c5 is a check. I know that a lot of you are probably thinking this. There's a couple of moves that I liked here. What do you think is the most accurate? If you're watching on YouTube, just pause for a second and think about it. So the move that I intended, and maybe it's not the best, the move that I intended to play is knight e4. This is the move that I intended to play. What does this threaten? This threatens bishop c5. And this is what I call the Rosen-Bates idea. This is a very common idea where you push the pawn and then put a piece on the square that was vacated by that pawn. Because often that square is prime real estate on the board. I've shown this example a million times, but here it is once again. This is kind of a textbook game that's been featured in some books. Rosen versus Bates. This is the critical position. What did white do after h6? Who can give me the entire sequence? So if you're not familiar with the concept, your instinct is probably to play bishop h4. Like, why would we give up the bishop and give black the dark squares? But if you know the concept, you understand that bishop f6 is the preface, and now there's a brilliant idea. What is it? It's e5. It's e5, d takes e5, and knight e4. Same thing. And this works tactically because if black takes, we take on f6. That's a check. Black loses the rook. And once the bishop moves, just look at how beautiful this position is. This knight on e4 is dominant. The king side is collapsing, and white won very, very quickly. Okay, so let's go back to the game. Yeah, what I'm saying is black can respond here with b6, but after f takes e5, knight takes e5, white can probably win this in a million different ways. Essentially, choose your pick. But the takeaway here, and our opponent allowed the sack, which I think is very, very clearly totally devastating. Just look at this position. It should be very clear to you, even if you're a newer player, that this is completely overwhelming, just because everything is coming in. So one important thing is that behind a lot of these instinctual decisions is pattern recognition. So like knowledge of this concept, that's exactly what pattern recognition is, but it's not this mythical idea. It's something that can be developed, A, by solving a ton of tactics, and B, by keeping your eyes open for instructive games and instructive concepts. Any questions? Is it clear to people, let me pull the Twitch chat, that this position is winning? Is it intuitively clear, looking at this position, that you should be winning here? Yes, it is. Okay, good. Next game. Black against Ramanampi. I think we're going to play probably three games in this speedrun. Okay, let's go e5. Let's go knight c6. This is the Nimzovich-Larsen. Knight f3. Okay, so this is actually the modern way to play. We respond with e4. This is theory. The old move, by the way, is a3. Is e3, and I'll talk a little bit about this after the game. So here, again, there's a little bit of specific theory that you should know in this line, but the important thing is that you always play d takes c6 in this position. You don't capture toward the center, you capture away from the center, of course, in order to open up the bishop, and in order to open up the queen, exerting, together with the e-pawn, great control over the center. Now, the dark squared bishop typically comes out to d6, and you might say, well, doesn't this kind of counteract the influence of the queen? Well, yes, But the bishop on d6 is aiming at h2. In case white castles kingside, there won't be a Greek gift sacrifice, but there might be the preconditions for a later tactic. And the queen is going to come out to e7. This is how we're going to set up our pieces. Let's go queen e7. White is very likely to push d3 at some point, or d4. But black has a great position here. It's about equal. It's about equal. f3. Let's take it. Rook takes f3. Whoa. Okay, our opponent playing very loosey-goosey here. Very loosey-goosey. I am going to go knight to g4, attacking the h-pawn, trying to provoke another weakness on the king side, and then the knight drops back to e5. Of course, white can also play g3, but that's potentially even more weakening. I think we might have some tactics there. Rook f2. Okay, that's clearly a panicked reaction, but once you sense that you're this close to winning, it's important to pause for a second and try to be accurate, because then you take away the possibility that your opponent, kind of stays in the game and eventually pulls off a swindle. So obviously we need to take on h2 first. Now we can probably take the rook. We have other moves, but I don't really see a reason to be fancy here. I think we can just go directly for checkmate. Let's get our queen involved with a check. And let's set up some mating patterns with bishop g3. Setting up the threat of queen h1. This is kind of a very, very common construction. White has to move the bishop out. It's not totally over yet. Bishop f3. That's a bad move, though. This allows checkmate in 2 moves. And it's very fitting that our final piece comes out with checkmate. I really like when that happens. Now, this was an easy game because white just didn't handle the opening properly. Now, the Nimzovich-Larsen is not a bad opening. It's kind of a cagey opening that's seen quite a bit of development in recent years. There's a good chessable course on it by Adibon. I would not recommend it to the vast majority of beginner and intermediate players because you're not developing the right kinds of skills. In order to play this opening successfully, you have to understand how to properly violate the rules, give up the center, and you have to know a lot of theory. Just because there is a player who's been successful in a line doesn't necessarily mean that you should play it. So here, the main move is e3. And I won't delve too deeply into this move. Black has many ways to respond to this. The most common is knight f6, bishop b5, and now this weird-looking move, bishop to d6, which may strike you as extremely awkward because it buries the bishop on c8. But the logic behind this move is that, for instance, after knight e2, a6, white is going to have to play bishop takes c6. There's no other choice because after bishop c4, we literally trap the bishop. And now we hit the rook here. Okay? So here, white has to take on c6. And much like in the game, we play d takes c6 and everything is copacetic. In this game, we face the kind of modern move, which is knight f3. We respond with e4, knight d4, and we just develop our pieces, knight f6. So we actually want white to play knight takes c6. As you could see in the game, this gives us fantastic development. It opens up the bishop, and it opens up the center, which is in our favor because we control a bit bigger share of it, and we have better development. Okay, bishop d6 should be logical to you. Bishop e2 castles, queen e7. Why did we play this move? To prepare rook d8 and to solidify the e-pawn. f3 is already the beginning of the end. It's a very, very weakening move. I think white should have played d3, to which we probably would have still responded rook to d8 or bishop to f5. So instead, f3, e takes f3. Definitely white should have taken with the bishop. White played rook takes f3, and now knight g4. This was the main instinctive decision that won us the game. How did I make it so quickly? Well, it should be a pretty intuitive move too, because the risk to reward ratio is extremely positive. This is not a risky move. We're not sacking anything. The knight can drop back to e5, but what we're doing is we're provoking very serious weakness on the king side. If white had played h3, we drop the knight back to an excellent centralized square. We are never afraid that white trades because this gives up white's main bishop and essentially loses the game. Now, if white drops back to f1, we can start accumulating and assembling our other pieces on the king side and trying to use the holes that we have created, such as with a move like queen to g5. Now we're threatening bishop takes h3, and already white is in huge trouble. Even queen h4, although queen h4 may be queen e1. So I really like queen to g5. Even bishop takes h3 can be considered, but I wouldn't do something like that. So the idea of provoking weaknesses is, particularly for newer players, something that you should pay attention to. A move like knight g4, the point is not to go directly for checkmate. It's to weaken squares so that later on our attack is more effective. In addition, I was a little bit worried about the prospect that white would take on f6. I said, didn't you just say that white, we are never afraid of this? No, well, here, obviously, this is a different story. I don't think that black is worse here. Why allow this to happen? Any questions about this game? Simple game. After white played rook f2, the rest was a matter of technique. Don't automatically capture pieces when you get excited. Take a moment because there might be a better move. What if he plays knight g5 instead of knight d4? Oh, question about the opening. Well, knight g5 blunders the knight. Yeah, so this is a pretty forcing line. There's more theory here, but I'm sure we'll get another chance to talk about this. Let's keep going. Probably one more game for now. Playing a 1300, and we do cross 1300 with this game. All right, so I will go for the King's Indian from the very beginning this time. I think people will like this. Bishop to g5. That's kind of a sideline, and it doesn't really change our reaction. We're going to go d6 for starters. And there's many ways of facing this variation. This is called the Smyslov variation. It's a decent line. There's nothing much to say about it. I'm going to castle. I'm going to play this in the simplest possible way. Another 5 subs from Mr. Bortnyk. And we're going to play the move c5, contesting the center, trying to open up the diagonal for our bishop. Bishop to e2, we're going to develop our knight. White castles. I have to say our opponent is playing the opening quite well. Now we're going to complete our development with bishop f5. Again, the way that I am playing this with black is not necessarily what I would do in a classical game. It's just a decent setup that's pretty easy to play. a3. Okay. a3. a3. Okay, many tempting ways that we can play this with black. Many tempting ways that we could play this. Here's what we're going to do. I don't know what we're going to do yet. We're going to start with g5. We're going to chase away the bishop. And now we're going to put the knight on e4. And this move, knight to e4, this trade is very common in King's Indian positions because what we have achieved, number one, is that we have cleared the obstacles for our dark squared bishop, which is now extremely strong. The other main thing is that we have loosened white's control over the center. Again, our opponent is handling this extremely well. If we play knight to a5, we might run into b4. So we're going to reroute the knight back around to d7. We can ignore the attack on b7. It's a false attack. Rook a d1. And now we're going to start operations on the queen side. Let's begin by playing the move a6 and preparing b5. Like knight d2, we drop the bishop back always to g6 in these types of positions, bishop f3. And I think it's a great time for us to open up the queen side with b5. Takes. Okay, he doesn't take. Now we're going to put a rook on b8, continuing the pressure down the b file. Our knight can also jump into e5 at some point. Yeah, definitely white is underrated by a bit, but the game is starting to turn in our favor. Now we play b takes e4, opening up the file. And now, do we want to take this bishop? It's not a bad idea, but actually I am going to let them, our opponent, take on g6. Why do I do that? For a very simple reason. We're opening up the f file, and I'm already looking at these two rooks. And I'm already looking at this f pawn because the knight is very likely to move at some point. And I'm, again, trying to create the preconditions for some sort of an attack down the second rank. Now, which piece is not playing here? Clearly the queen. We have an excellent square on a5, also because it attacks the knight. Okay, we're close to winning now. We're up a pawn. And at this level, people collapse very quickly when you put this much pressure and they already feel like the game is going down the toilet. A blunder often ensues. This is GG. Rook c1. Now, there's a million ways of winning this position, but I see a way to force the queen trade, which is to play knight b6. Contact between pieces. I talk about this at length. Anytime one of your pieces makes contact with one of your opponent's pieces, it sounds like a very primitive point, but it's actually very central to consistent tactical vision, particularly if it's a situation with heavy pieces. That's a tactical precondition. It doesn't mean there's always going to be something, but you should kind of automatically consider the idea that, okay, if I chase away the queen, white is going to have a hard time keeping the rook protected. Now we can exchange. We can take either pawn. Let's take d5, the center pawn. And, okay, now white blunders the rook and the game is over. Okay, fantastic. Now, in the previous speedrun, I didn't start out by playing the King's Indian. I was playing the Grunfeld. I still think the Grunfeld is a great decision. In this speedrun, I've decided to play my actual repertoire. And my recommendation for people who want to learn the King's Indian, want to learn openings in this speedrun is to pay more attention to the way I'm playing rather than getting too bogged down in theory. Particularly with the King's Indian, which is an opening that, yes, has a lot of theory, but you also have to develop great instincts for how to play it. If you understand the ideas of the King's Indian, even if you know zero theory, you can actually play it very, very decently just if you understand the setups and why the pieces are where they are. Okay, so bishop g5, d6, knight f3, castles, and e3. The one important point that I will make in this game, in this analysis, is that in the King's Indian, there are essentially two ways to strike at the center. There's c5, which we played in this game, which is kind of the more Benoni-style move. And there's, of course, e5, which is the more traditional King's Indian way to play. But a lot of people, they assume that e5 has to be played, that they are morally obligated in every position to prepare e5. And there are many situations where stubbornly trying to play e5 is actually not a great idea. Here it blunders a pawn, takes and knight e5. But even if you prepare it with a move like knight bd7, I'm not the biggest fan of this setup because it justifies the placement of white's bishop. So here it makes perfect sense for us to play c5. There's another idea here, which is that anytime white pushes d5, this diagonal is open and the b2 pawn is going to be a long-term weakness because white has developed the bishop to g5. There's also maybe a King's Indian course on Chessable that will be coming out some point in the near future. Another great example of a line in which you don't want to play e5 is the Averbach variation, where white plays bishop e2 and then bishop to g5. This is another instance where the main move here and the top engine move is c5. Why is e5 bad here? If you're watching on YouTube, great opportunity to pause and start developing your understanding by refuting this move. e5 essentially loses the game. Why? Yeah, so takes the queen, and knight to d5, and black is in huge trouble. This is actually just a fork. That's all it is just a fork. If you take, you drop the exchange, and the only move here, I think, is, yeah, that's basically the only thing you can do. Yeah, black is busted. I mean, knight bd7 you can play, but you drop a pawn, and it's a terrible position. Okay? So here again, you want to play c5. So the takeaway from this first King's Indian game is that you should be flexible to pushing e5, pushing c5, and you should rush neither of these moves. Sometimes you can play it without making one of these moves for a long time. c5, knight c6. Also, you're not really afraid, in most cases, of the move d5. This knight can go to a variety of different places. Often, you want to play knight a5, flouting the rule about knights on the rim, because the knight on a5 is actually not a bad piece here. Hitting c4, and it's part of a larger campaign of queenside expansion. We'll put that aside for now. I threw in the move h6 just to make the bishop decide on a spot, completing our development. g5, why did I play this? To force the bishop onto a bad square. This is a move that will be hard to play for a lot of newer players because you are weakening your king, but we are so active here that I really wasn't worried about anything happening. And when you have a fianchettoed bishop, you can often allow yourself more liberties with your kingside pawn structure. And once the trade happens, we're already threatening to win the d4 pawn by taking the knight and playing c takes d4. So we're essentially forcing white to push d5. Here we drop back to b8. There was a tactic that we had to avoid. After knight a5, white has the move b4. And you might say, but wait a second, we just take the rook. But once white takes the bishop, not only have we given up the dark squared bishop, but we're actually also losing the knight. Knight b3, queen b2, the knight is trapped. Okay, so this is something to watch for. Anytime the knight is on a5 or h5, you have to be vigilant about moves like b4. Okay, so therefore, we drop the knight back to its initial square in order to reroute it around to d7. Queen b3 was a pretty bad move. Of course, we're not afraid of this. This should be pretty intuitively clear to you. White is just like collapsing here. The queen could get trapped. This is fantastic compensation for the pawn. Rook a d1, a6. Again, simply following what I know. Right? So you might be looking at this and saying, how did I play a6, b5 so quickly? This is a textbook idea. In this pawn structure, this is a pawn structure that can occur in the Benko Gambit, for instance, which is the most direct way to get this play and sacrifice the pawn. And if you know anything about the Benko Gambit, you know that the idea is to sack the pawn to ultimately open up these queenside files and develop play. And the King's Indian is like the English language. I think it's referred to as the zombie language sometimes because it like eats other languages. What I love about the King's Indian is that it's a very flexible opening, and therefore it borrows a lot of ideas from other openings, and it really helps develop your overall understanding. So one of those ideas is to prepare this campaign of queenside expansion with the ultimate aim of opening up the B file and going after the B2 pawn. So B5, this is not actually a sacrifice. If white takes it twice, we just play rook B8 and we win the pawn back. So this is not really a sacrifice, but our opponent kind of ignored everything that was happening. And after B takes E4, the game is essentially over. We infiltrate with rook takes B2. Notice that I left the bishops where they are to open up the F file for our other rook. If white would have captured on A6, which is probably the correct move, there's a million things that black can do. We can play queen A8 to try to get the queens off the board. We can play H5 and try to kick the bishop away. There's a million different moves. Queen A5, getting the queen out. White is collapsing, and our opponent blundered the knight. Knight E4, we can play knight B6. We can play knight E5. There's a million possible moves here. Black is much, much better. One recommendation for people watching this, yes, the analysis is a little bit more sparse, but as I explained at the start, this is kind of the point. I'm trying to give you the kind of big view of the game and why I make the decisions that I make. If you come across something and you're confused about why I'm saying a particular position is good or bad, set it up yourself and spend a little bit of time analyzing with the engine. Okay? This is an opportunity for you to further your understanding, and just kind of looking at positions in an open-ended fashion is exactly how you improve. Right? So I would, if you want to be truly diligent, mark down the moments where you're kind of confused about something, and then spend 5-10 minutes analyzing that position. This is not just a case of me being lazy. Active learning is extremely important in chess. I can't feed you everything with a spoon. You have to acquire certain knowledge yourself. So we win our first King's Indian game. Nothing to talk about after we take the knight. And I think this is a good spot to end, guys. So this was the first video of the new speedrun. Please, it was a little bit on the shorter side. If you like this format and you want me to continue, the next videos will be longer. Please give me your honest feedback in the comments. And I hope you guys enjoyed. Welcome to the new speedrun. We're definitely going to play more interesting games. And give me your honest opinion. I can always revert back to the old format. But for now, thanks everybody. And I hope you guys enjoyed the stream. This was a long one. I'm going to get some rest. Thanks, guys.